They defied the ancient rule. In the galaxy, do not provoke the humans. The first thing I noticed was that the elders had gone quiet. Not the polite kind of quiet that fills a council chamber between speakers. Not the respectful silence that follows a difficult announcement. This was a different kind of quiet entirely. The kind that spreads across a room the way cold spreads across skin. The kind that makes your heart beat a little faster before your brain even understands why. My name is Kael'thas. I am a xenopolitical analyst for the Vortian Collective. I have spent 40 years studying the behavior of civilizations, reading the patterns of galactic history, tracking the rise and fall of alliances with the same careful attention that some beings give to art or faith. I thought I was good at my job. I thought I understood the galaxy. I was sitting in the secondary observation gallery of the High Council chamber on Vortian Prime when the news came through. A priority signal, highest classification, routed through 6 layers of diplomatic encryption, the kind of signal that arrives maybe twice in a generation. I watched Ambassador Selora receive it. She is 4,000 years old. I have seen her navigate planetary collapses, species extinctions, and the collapse of 3 different interstellar empires without so much as a change in her breathing pattern. She read the message once. Then she set down her data tablet very carefully on the table in front of her, as if she was afraid of what her hands might do if they were not occupied. Then she sat completely still for 11 seconds. I counted. She said, very quietly, to no one in particular, "Begin evacuation protocols for all species within 8 light-years of the Drathkai border." The room did not explode into panic. That was almost worse. Instead, every elder in that chamber moved with the focused, deliberate speed of people who had prepared for something they had always hoped would never come. Communications officers began routing signals. Defensive liaisons pulled up star maps. Someone near the back started reciting coordinates in a low, steady voice that did not waver even once. I leaned toward Counselor Fevrak, who was sitting beside me. He is young by Vortian standards, only 800 years old, and he handles trade route negotiations for the outer territories. He is not easily alarmed. He looked alarmed. "What happened?" I asked. He did not look at me. He was watching Selora. "The Drathkai seized 3 human colony ships on the frontier," he said. "They took the crews. They broadcast it." I processed that for a moment. "How many humans?" "Approximately 460. I had covered Drathkai expansionism for the better part of a decade. The Drathkai Dominion was aggressive, militaristic, and had a long history of seizing vessels they deemed to be trespassing in contested space. They had done similar things before, to at least 6 other species. It was ugly. It was a diplomatic problem, and it usually ended in long negotiations and eventual release with minor reparations. The Drathkai were bullies, but they were calculated bullies. They understood the cost-benefit of open conflict. Or so I had believed. "Why is this different?" I asked. Fevrak finally looked at me. There was something in his expression I had never seen there before. "Because they are human," he said, as if that explained everything. It explained nothing to me. That was the problem. I requested the relevant files that afternoon. Diplomatic History of Human Vortian Relations, Standard. Human Territorial Boundaries, Standard. Record of Previous Human Military Engagements, Standard and Slim. Humanity had been a formal member of the galactic community for just over 600 years, and they had been involved in only a handful of documented conflicts, none of them particularly large by galactic standards. By any objective measure, they were a mid-tier civilization. Young, energetic, spread across perhaps 300 colonized worlds, with a military force that our intelligence offices assessed at somewhere between 380 and 420 active warships. The Drathkai Dominion fielded 12,000. The numbers were not close. None of that explained the quiet in the council chamber. So I did something I had never done before. I submitted a formal request to access the First Contact Classification Archive. These are the sealed records from the earliest period of a civilization's integration into the galactic community. Every species has one. Most are boring. They document first meetings, initial language attempts, early trade agreements, the usual fumbling first steps of a new voice, learning how to speak in a very old conversation. Human first contact files were sealed at level 7. I had never even heard of a level 7 sealing. The highest classification I had ever encountered in my entire career was level 4, and that had been for the records surrounding the extinction of the Catharan, a civilization that had disappeared so completely that most historians now debate whether they ever existed at all. It took me 6 hours and 3 separate authorization requests to even get a response. Then Salora herself contacted me. She did not ask why I wanted the files. She simply looked at me through the comm screen for a long moment with those ancient, tired eyes, and then she said, "You are going to wish you had not asked." She approved the request anyway. I think she believed it was time for someone to know. I think she had been carrying the knowledge alone for too long. The files arrived at midnight. Local cycle. I sat down at my workstation with a cup of warming root tea and a professional curiosity that I fully expected to satisfy within a couple of hours. I was still reading at dawn. The first observer reports were written 603 years ago by a joint diplomatic team from 4 of the oldest galactic civilizations, sent to make contact with a small, blue, water-rich planet circling an ordinary star in an unimpressive spiral arm of the galaxy. The team expected to find what they usually found at that stage of a civilization's development, a species still divided by tribal politics, probably in the early stages of learning to cooperate on a planetary scale, likely eager to make a good first impression on the wider community. What they found was a species that had spent its entire evolutionary history in constant, total competition with everything around it. Not competition in the gentle, ecological sense that most species experience. Something rawer than that. Something that had been ground into the biology and the psychology over hundreds of thousands of years of surviving on a world that was trying, in 100 different ways, to end them. The lead observer, an Etheri named Vossilen who had conducted 47 first contact missions over a career spanning 2,000 years, wrote in her personal notes that she had never encountered anything quite like it. She described watching a human respond to a sudden physical threat with a speed and ferocity that she said made her instinctively take 3 steps backward before she had consciously decided to move. She wrote, "They do not react to danger the way other species do. There is no freeze. There is no hesitation. Something inside them turns on, like a switch, and whatever was there before simply steps aside." That was page 3. I had not yet touched my tea. By the time I reached the section marked Behavioral Pattern Analysis, Long-Duration Conflict Response, my hands had started to shake slightly. Not from fear, from something harder to name. A kind of slow, dawning recognition of something enormous that I had always been looking at from the wrong angle. Somewhere deep in a building I could not see, on a planet I had never visited, 460 human beings were being held in the dark. And somewhere in that same galaxy, a species that had survived everything its world had ever thrown at it was, at this very moment, waking up to what had been done to its people. I closed the file. I opened it again. I kept reading. There was a word underlined in the margin of one of the older reports, written by hand in the cramped notation style of an observer who had been dead for 5 centuries. The word was circled twice. It said, in old Etheri script, "Remember." I did not understand why at the time. I was beginning to. The second morning after the seizure, I arrived at the council chamber to find that 3 of the Silvari delegation had not come in at all. Their seats were simply empty. The Silvari are a deeply dignified species. They do not miss council sessions. They consider it a near-sacred obligation. I asked one of the remaining Silvari delegates, a quiet elder named Orison, where his colleagues were. He looked at me with eyes that had seen more centuries than I had years of life. "They are packing," he said simply. "Packing to go where?" "Away," he said. "Away from here." He would not say anything else. He turned back to his station and did not look up again for the rest of the session. The Drathkai, meanwhile, had released a second broadcast. They had dressed their captured humans in Dominion labor uniforms and displayed them in a public arena on their capital world. It was a performance. A signal sent to every civilization in the galaxy. Look what we have done. and see that nothing has happened to us. Watching the broadcast felt like watching someone walk to the edge of a very high drop, and then jump while smiling at the crowd. I went back to the files. I had barely slept. I had barely eaten. The root tea had gone cold and then gone away entirely, replaced at some point by a junior aide who left a food tray that I also ignored. I was deep in the section that the original observers had titled, with remarkable understatement, Additional Notes on Psychological Resilience. Let me try to explain what I read there, because it is important, and because most people in the galaxy do not know it, and because the Drathkai most certainly did not know it when they made their decision. When most species face a dangerous situation, they respond in one of several predictable ways. They retreat. They surrender. They negotiate. If they fight until the calculation shifts, and fighting no longer makes sense. And then they stop. This is rational. This is what intelligent species do. The ability to recognize the point at which resistance becomes futile, and to act accordingly is, in most civilizations, considered a mark of wisdom. Humans have this capacity. What makes them extraordinary is that they also have something else entirely, something that operates alongside the rational mind and sometimes, under specific conditions, overrides it completely. The observers called it several things in several languages. Some called it stubbornness. Some called it determination. One report called it, somewhat poetically, the refusal to accept the arithmetic. What they were all describing was the same observed phenomenon. When humans believe that what is being done to them or to the people they care about is wrong, the normal calculation breaks down. They stop asking whether they can win. They start asking only whether they are willing to stop. The distinction sounds small. It is not small. There is a record in the archives of a single human vessel that was intercepted by a pirate collective of 7 ships approximately 200 years ago, early in the period of human space expansion. The pirate collective was a known and documented threat. They had taken dozens of ships from half a dozen species over the previous decade. The formula was established. The targeted vessel surrendered. The crew was held for ransom. Negotiations happened. Credits were exchanged. The crew was released. Everybody understood the rules. The human vessel did not follow the rules. The crew of 43 held off the boarding party, retook their own engine room, used their own ship as a battering ram against the lead pirate vessel, and then fought ship to ship in vacuum. Not because they thought they could win, but because they were not willing to stop. When it was over, the pirate collective had lost 3 of its 7 ships. The human vessel was barely holding together. 11 of the 43 crew members were dead. The surviving 32 refused medical treatment until the 3 crew members who had been captured in the initial boarding were safely returned. One of the human survivors, when asked by the observer who documented the incident why they had not simply surrendered, reportedly shrugged and said, "They took our people." That was the entire explanation. That was sufficient. I sat back in my chair and looked at the ceiling for a long time. Then I kept reading. The physical details were not what surprised me most, though they were surprising enough. Human biology is a catalog of strange gifts. Their cardiovascular system can sustain enormous physical output for durations that leave most species collapsed and exhausted. They have an internal chemical response to threat and injury that increases their speed and strength and focus at the exact moment those things are most needed. A response that the original observers documented with something close to disbelief, noting that most species' biological responses to severe injury move in the opposite direction, toward shutdown and conservation, while humans in crisis often move toward acceleration. They heal at rates that initially caused the medical observers to question their instruments. They can function on minimal sleep for days at a time when the situation demands it, something their own medical literature acknowledges is not good for them, and which they do anyway with a casualness that baffled the observers. None of that was what kept me awake and staring. What kept me awake was the section on human history. They did this to each other. Before they ever reached space, before they had any enemies but themselves, they practiced. For thousands of years, on a single small world, they fought wars of a scale and ferocity that the observer team's historian described. In a note that I suspect he wrote in the middle of the night, in a state very similar to my own, as almost impossible to reconcile with a species that also produces music and medicine and painted ceilings. They built machines for it. They developed strategies and studied them across generations. They created entire systems of thought devoted to the question of how to break the will of an opponent, how to strike at the things that matter most, how to make the cost of continued conflict too high to bear. And then, having built all of that, having learned all of that, having carried all of that knowledge in their cultural memory, they reached the stars. They were not a primitive species that stumbled into the galaxy unprepared. They were a species that had spent its entire history being prepared, by the harshest possible teacher, for exactly the kind of situation that the Drathkai Dominion had just handed them. The Catharan fragment was near the end of the archive. It was short. It was written in a language that is now spoken by no living being, and the translation appended to it was clearly done in a hurry by someone who was not fully fluent. It described a border dispute. It described the Catharans' confidence in their numerical superiority. It described the first human response. Not a declaration, not a formal notice of intent, just a single message delivered through open channels that said, in the plainest possible language, that the people who had been taken needed to be returned. The Catharan had laughed. The fragment ended 11 days later with a single sentence: "They do not stop." There was nothing after that. The Catharan civilization produced no further records. They are gone from the galaxy so completely that the planet they lived on has been reclaimed by forest, and if you traveled there today, you would find nothing but trees and silence. I closed the archive. I sat in my quiet office on Vorshan Prime, and I thought about 460 humans held in a Drathkai facility, and I thought about the Drathkai High Command, who had reviewed the same intelligence reports I had once reviewed, and reached the conclusion that this was a manageable diplomatic situation. My comm unit chimed, a message from the Terran Diplomatic Corps, routed through the standard interspecies channel. It was addressed to all observer nations with active monitoring status in the Drathkai frontier region. The message was 3 sentences long. It said, "We are aware of the situation. We are grateful for the concern of our allies. We have already begun." The message was signed by Director Louise Hartley, head of the Terran Diplomatic Corps. I read it 3 times. I did not sleep at all that night. In the morning, I went back to the council chamber and watched the Silvari elder Orison finish his preparations to leave. He was methodical about it. Careful. The way you are careful when you are doing something you have spent a very long time hoping you would never have to do. I asked him one more time, "How long do you think it will take?" He paused. He thought about it with the seriousness that 4,000 years of experience earns you. "The Drathkai have 12,000 warships," he said. "I know. It does not matter," he said. He picked up his bag and walked toward the door. "Nothing about that matters at all." He left. I stood alone in the corridor outside the council chamber, and I finally, for the first time in my 40-year career, understood why a diplomat could weep at a news report. On the 43rd day, I stopped sleeping in my office and started sleeping in the Vorshan monitoring station at the edge of neutral space. I want to be clear about something before I describe what I saw there. I have studied warfare my entire professional life. I have read accounts of every major galactic conflict in recorded history. I understand strategy. I understand logistics. I understand the mathematics of military engagement, the principles of force projection, the doctrine of acceptable loss and strategic objective. I thought I had a complete picture of what organized armed conflict between spacefaring civilizations looked like. I did not have a complete picture. What I had was a drawing of a candle, and what I was about to watch was a star. The first thing that happened was so quiet that our monitoring equipment almost missed it. The human colonies along the Drathkai frontier went dark. Not dark in the sense of destroyed or seized. Dark in the sense of silent. Every civilian communication signal, every standard trade beacon, every routine navigation broadcast, all of it stopped simultaneously across a front of approximately 60 light-years. From the outside, it looked as if 340 human colonial settlements had simply ceased to exist. Our analysts spent 4 hours trying to determine what had happened. Then one of our younger technicians, a quick-thinking Vortian named Asalan who cannot have been more than 80 years old, pulled up a very old theoretical paper from the archives of a dead civilization and said quietly, "They have gone dark intentionally. They are removing their civilian communication signature so that enemy targeting systems cannot distinguish between civilian and military signals." She paused. "That means they have decided to move military assets into those regions, and they do not want anyone to know where." The senior analyst on duty looked at her for a long moment. "How old is that paper?" he asked. "About 400 years, she said. "It is Kataran. It is from their war college. It is the last paper their war college ever published." The room was quiet. I pressed my face closer to the observation window and watched the dark frontier and tried to count things that could not be counted from this distance. On the 47th day, the first Drathkai signals were intercepted. Internal communications, encrypted but not well enough. Our analysts had better decryption tools than the Drathkai knew. 3 Drathkai resupply stations along the frontier had gone offline. Not attacked, not destroyed. Offline. Their power systems had simply stopped functioning, simultaneously, with no warning and no prior indication of any kind of external interference. The Drathkai technical team spent 3 days trying to determine whether it was a malfunction or an act of deliberate interference. By the time they concluded it was deliberate, 2 more stations had gone offline, and a Drathkai communications relay hub, not a military target, just an information routing station that happened to also carry military signals, had simply vanished from the sensor registry, as if it had never been there. I watched the Drathkai internal traffic spike with confusion, and then with alarm. Their high command began rerouting. They brought additional power systems online for their remaining infrastructure. They moved more ships to the frontier to demonstrate strength and presence. This, I would understand later, was exactly what the humans wanted them to do. On the 52nd day, I spoke with the Silvari elder Selora, for the first time since she had approved my access to the first contact files. She had not left, as some of the others had. She had stayed. I think she felt responsible for what was coming, in the way that someone who has kept a very important secret for a very long time feels responsible when the secret finally becomes real. I told her what I had seen in the monitoring data. She listened without surprise. "They are mapping," she said. "The supply lines," I agreed. "Not only the supply lines," she said. "Every firing pattern, every shield frequency, every FTL jump signature, every communication pathway, every weakness in every system." She looked out at the stars through the station's observation port. "They lost 60 colony ships to the Drathkai patrol fleets in the first 2 weeks. Did you know that?" I had not known that. It had not appeared in any of the official briefings. 60 ships, I said. That is not a defeat," she said. "That is a lesson. They sent those ships to learn how the Drathkai fight, what they target first, how long their response times are, where their patrol gaps are. They paid in ships and lives for information that no sensor could give them, and they paid that price deliberately." She paused. "I have lived 4,000 years, Kael'thos. I have seen many wars. I have never seen a species spend its own people to learn how to win more efficiently." I did not know what to say to that. On the 59th day, the Drathkai launched their great offensive. 600 warships, sent in a coordinated strike against what their intelligence suggested were the 2 primary human staging areas near the frontier. It was a massive display of power. It was exactly the kind of overwhelming force demonstration that the Drathkai had used successfully to end conflicts with 4 other species in the previous 2 centuries. They struck both targets with full force. Both targets were empty. Not evacuated in a hurry. Empty, as if no one had ever been there at all. The Drathkai fleet spent 11 hours searching the surrounding space for any sign of the human forces that should have been there. They found debris consistent with abandoned equipment. They found some automated systems still running on routine cycles. They found nothing that could shoot back. Then, while 600 of their best warships were spread across 2 empty star systems trying to figure out what had happened, the humans hit 11 targets simultaneously. Not military targets. Logistics targets. The Drathkai fuel processing hub at Gorath Station, the one that supplied 40% of the Dominion's frontier fleet, ceased to function in the span of about 40 minutes. Not destroyed, disabled. Precisely, carefully, deliberately disabled, in a way that would take months to repair, and that left the structure itself mostly intact. 3 major FTL communication relay points went down within minutes of each other, splitting the Dominion's command network into 3 separate sections that could no longer talk to each other in real time. A network of automated resupply drones was hijacked, not destroyed, hijacked, and redirected to locations that the Drathkai could not access without pulling ships away from other positions. I was watching the sensor feeds when it happened. I watched the Drathkai's vast frontier fleet, 12,000 warships, the single largest military force in this sector of the galaxy, simply stop being able to function as a coordinated unit. They still had the ships, every single one of them. They still had the weapons, the crews, the fuel that was already in their tanks. Nothing had been destroyed. Nothing had been lost in any conventional military sense. They just could not move. They could not talk to each other. They could not resupply. They could not coordinate. In one afternoon, the largest military force in the sector had been turned into 12,000 separate, isolated problems. I sat down very slowly in my chair and stared at the display for a long time. Selin, the young analyst, came and stood beside me. She was looking at the same data. They did not fight the fleet, she said, mostly to herself. No, I agreed. They fought everything that lets the fleet be a fleet, she said. I nodded. I thought about the first contact files. I thought about the paper from the Catharan War College. I thought about a species that had spent thousands of years fighting every kind of war there is, on a single world, against itself, learning every lesson the hard way, keeping every piece of knowledge and passing it forward to the next generation, and the next, and the next, until the civilization that reached the stars carried inside it 600 centuries of accumulated understanding of exactly this, single question. How do you break something much larger than yourself? You do not break the thing itself. You break everything the thing depends on. On the 63rd day, I was approached in the corridor outside the monitoring room by someone I did not recognize. He was wearing the plain, unranked uniform of a human liaison officer, which meant he was attached to one of the small diplomatic observer teams that had been stationed at Vorshan facilities since the beginning of the crisis. He was young by human standards, I thought, perhaps 30 of their years, perhaps a little more, dark-skinned, medium height, with the particular kind of posture that I had started to recognize in military personnel regardless of species. Very still when still, very precise when moving. He introduced himself as Sergeant Nathan Okafor, assigned to the Human Observer Liaison Team. He said he had been asked to introduce himself to the senior analysts and make himself available for questions. I asked him the only question I had been thinking about for 63 days. "Are you afraid?" I said. He thought about it. He was not dismissive. He considered the question as if it deserved a real answer. "Every day," he said. "Yes." "But you continue," I said. "Yes," he said. I waited to see if there was more to it. He seemed to think about whether to elaborate. Then he said, "We are more angry than we are afraid. That helps." A pause. We do not always do well when we are angry and afraid at the same time. It is something our people know about ourselves. I thought about the Catharan War College paper. I thought about the fragment that ended mid-sentence. "I think I understand," I said. He nodded politely. But I could see in his expression that he did not think I understood at all. And looking back now, knowing everything I know, I believe he was right. I did not understand yet. Not fully. Not the most important part. That part was still coming. On the 71st day, the Drathkai High Command sent a communication to the Terran Diplomatic Corps requesting to open negotiations. Director Hartley responded within 6 hours. She accepted the opening of talks, she said, with one condition. The condition was not territorial, not financial, not military. It was 9 words long. It said, "The people you took must be home first." The Drathkai High Command, according to the intercepted internal communications I reviewed later, spent 3 days arguing about whether this was a trap. It was not a trap. It was a requirement. It was, in fact, the only requirement that had ever mattered to begin with. Everything else, every disabled station, every isolated fleet, every severed communication line, had been in service of 9 words. They took our people. I went back to the archives that night. I pulled up the original first contact report. I found the section I had read on my first night with the files, the part that had made my hands shake. There was a line I had underlined without realizing I had done it. I do not remember underlining it. But there it was, in my own notation ink, a single sentence from the observer named Vossislan, written 600 years ago after weeks of careful study. She had written, "I do not think they are dangerous because they are strong. I think they are dangerous because, under the right circumstances, they do not stop." Underneath it, in the same ink, apparently written in the same sitting and then almost immediately crossed out, as if the writer had second-guessed herself, were 4 more words. The crossing out was thin enough that I could read through it. It said, "Pray for the Drathkai." The prison ships were called processing vessels in the official Drathkai fleet registry. I learned this detail from the unredacted after-action report that was shared with Vortian observers 3 days after the human boarding teams went in. That report was written in the flat, careful language of military documentation, the kind of language that is designed to carry information without carrying emotion, because the people who write those reports understand that if they let the emotion in, they will not be able to finish writing. I read it in one sitting. I did not speak to anyone for several hours afterward. I am not going to describe in detail what those 460 people had experienced in their 93 days of captivity. It is not necessary, and it is not my story to tell in that way. What I will say is that the team that went in to bring them home, 41 human special operations personnel, trained for exactly this kind of operation, held their professional composure throughout the entire 17-hour extraction process. Every one of them did their job. Every one of them kept it together until every single one of the 460 was confirmed safe and accounted for, and aboard the extraction ships. The after-action report noted, in its careful, flat language, that psychological processing support was required for all extraction personnel following the completion of the operation. It noted this in the same tone used to note that ammunition supplies had been replenished and fuel reserves topped off, required maintenance, standard procedure, the expected cost of doing the work. I thought about Sergeant Okafor's words, "We do not always do well when we are angry and afraid at the same time." I thought about 41 people holding themselves together, by will alone, for 17 hours, because the job was not done yet and people were counting on them. And then, when it was done, and the counting was over, and everyone was home and safe, only then, only in that moment, letting it out. I found that more remarkable than anything in the tactical reports. On the 88th day, the Drathkai High Command formally transmitted surrender documentation through the neutral channel maintained by the Vortian Collective. I was in the communications room when it came through. I had started living there, essentially. I slept in the monitoring station. I ate at my workstation. The young analyst Aselin had started bringing me food at regular intervals, which I suspect was on the instruction of someone more senior who was worried about my basic functioning. The surrender document was 60 pages long. It covered territorial concessions, fleet decommissioning schedules, reparation structures, and about 40 other things that I would normally have found enormously interesting from a political analysis perspective. Director Louise Hartley's response was 14 pages. The first 12 pages were about the non-human species living within the Drathkai Dominion, specifically 3 species, the Velran, the Oshu, and the Marath, who had been living under Drathkai authority for between 100 and 400 years, in conditions that the human legal teams characterized as forced subjugation, the conditions they cited, the specific protections they required, the minimum standards of autonomous governance they would need to verify. 12 pages about 3 species that had no formal alliance with humanity, 3 species that had never signed a treaty with the Terran government, 3 species whose situation had nothing to do, in any direct military or political sense, with the original seizure of the colony ships. Humanity was negotiating on their behalf anyway. I remember staring at that document and trying to fit it into every analytical framework I had ever used to understand how civilizations behave, and finding that none of them worked. In my 40 years of experience, I had never seen a victorious power negotiate for the benefit of people who were not their own. Not once. Not in any recorded history that I had access to. I brought it to Silora. She was not surprised. She read the document and nodded slowly, as if this confirmed something she had already known. Why? I asked her. They gained nothing from this. They were already winning. The Drathkai were already surrendering. Silora set the document down. You have read the first contact files, she said. Yes. Then you read the behavioral pattern section. Yes. What did it say about the values humans apply to conflict? I thought back. I had read so much, over so many days, that specific passages had blurred together. But I remembered the section she was pointing to. I remembered it because it was the part that had surprised me most, when I first read it. More than the physical endurance data, more than the historical warfare record, more than any of the tactical observations. It said they have a strong orientation toward what they call fairness, I said slowly. That they apply this orientation not only to their own situations, but to situations they observe. That they have a documented behavioral response to perceived injustice that functions somewhat similarly to their response to personal threat. Yes, Silora said. But this goes beyond that. They are spending political capital. They are taking on an obligation that will cost them resources and time, and diplomatic complexity for years, for 3 species they barely know. Yes, Silora said again. Why? She looked at me for a long moment. Because it is wrong, she said. And they know it is wrong. And once they know something is wrong, and they have the power to change it, they cannot. They genuinely cannot, simply not do it. She paused. This is as much a part of what they are as the rest of it. It is why the first contact team was both afraid of them and completely fascinated by them at the same time. They are frightening. They are also, she stopped, as if searching for a word. They are also coherent, she said at last. They are the most internally coherent species I have ever encountered. I thought about that for a long time. I had been invited to meet with Director Hartley in person, in the small conference room that the human diplomatic team used at our station. I almost declined. I was not sure what I would say to her. I had spent 90 days watching her people dismantle a military empire and simultaneously negotiate the liberation of other species' populations, and I was not entirely sure that my usual analytical vocabulary was adequate to the conversation. I went anyway. She was a small woman, shorter than I expected, with gray-streaked dark hair, and the kind of stillness about her that you see in people who have spent decades making very high-stakes decisions, and have learned how to carry that weight without letting it show on the surface. She was perhaps 50 of her years old, which by human standards puts her roughly in the middle of her life. She had fine lines around her eyes. She looked like someone who had not slept quite enough for the past 3 months, and was managing it with discipline and coffee, a human beverage I had seen them consuming in quantities that our medical observers considered alarming. She offered me a seat. I sat. We looked at each other for a moment across the table. You read our files, she said. It was not a question. Yes, I said. All of them? As many as I was permitted access to. She nodded. She did not seem bothered by this. She wrapped both hands around a cup of that dark beverage and looked at me with a directness that I had come to associate with human communication. The way they make eye contact without the elaborate social modulation that most other species use to indicate hierarchy and intent. You have questions, she said. Many, I said. But I will ask only one. She waited. The rule, I said. The ancient prohibition. The one that every elder species knows, and no one writes down. Did you know about it? She smiled. It was a small smile, and there was something very old in it. something that did not fit with the 50 years of her face, something that felt like it belonged in the archives. "We knew about it before most of the current elder species did," she said. "We have known about it for a very long time." I stared at her. "Then you understood what the Drathkai were risking?" "Yes." "And you did not warn them?" She set down her cup. "We sent 3 diplomatic missions," she said, very calmly. "We sent them in the first 2 weeks. They were rejected. The 3rd team was held briefly, and then returned without any of their communications equipment." She looked at me steadily. "We warned them, Kael'thas. They chose not to listen." I thought about the unopened diplomatic channels. I had known about them in the abstract but had filed them under routine posturing. "The rule," I said carefully. "Why does it exist? Who put it there?" She looked at me for a long time, long enough that I began to think she had decided not to answer. Then she said, "We did." I sat very still. "The rule is not a warning others put in place to warn the galaxy about us," she said quietly. "We put it there. A very long time ago, in the early period of our expansion, when we were still learning what we were capable of when someone hurt the people we cared about." She paused. "We put it there to warn ourselves, to remind ourselves of what we become, because we do not always like what we become, and we would rather remember that clearly than pretend it is something other than what it is." The room was very quiet. I thought about the Catharan fragment. I thought about the word remember, circled in the margin of a report written by someone dead for 5 centuries. I thought about the Silvari elder weeping in the council chamber. I thought about Sergeant Okafor saying, with quiet simplicity, "We do not always do well with that combination." I thought about 41 people holding themselves together for 17 hours. I thought about 12 pages of a surrender document devoted to 3 species that had nothing to do with the original fight. "You are afraid of yourselves," I said. "Sometimes," she said. "The healthy part of us is." She picked up her cup again. "The healthy part keeps the rest in check. Most of the time." I left that meeting and walked for a long time through the corridors of the monitoring station without any clear destination. I was not doing analysis. I was not forming conclusions. I was simply walking, and thinking, and trying to reorganize everything I had understood about the galaxy into a shape that included what I now knew. The Drathkai Dominion formally signed the final peace agreement on the 93rd day. The signing was witnessed by 11 galactic civilizations, and took place aboard a neutral station in unclaimed space. Director Hartley signed for the Terran government. She used a plain pen. She did not make a speech. The Dominion ceased to function as a military entity within 6 months. The process of its restructuring, the dismantling of the command hierarchy, the establishment of new governance frameworks for the subjugated species, the process of what the humans called accountability for those responsible for the worst of what had happened on the prison ships, took considerably longer. The humans were involved in every step, not to control it, to make sure it was done correctly. That distinction mattered, I realized. It mattered enormously. I watched all of it from a distance, filling report after report, building the most comprehensive external documentation of human conflict behavior that any non-human analyst had ever assembled. I did not know at the time that it would become what it eventually became. I was simply writing what I saw because writing was how I processed things, and I had seen more than I knew how to process in any other way. There is a courtyard at the center of the new interspecies embassy on Earth. I know this because I stood in it on the first day the building was opened to foreign diplomatic personnel, 6 months after the peace agreement was signed and 14 months after Selora had wept in the council chamber. Earth was not what I expected. I am not sure what I expected. After everything I had read, after everything I had watched from monitoring stations and data feeds and intercepted communications, I think part of me had constructed something in my mind that matched the archives, something harder, heavier, built for endurance and conflict, a world that looked the way the species felt. What I found was a planet of extraordinary, almost unreasonable beauty, oceans that covered most of the surface and moved in the light in ways that made it difficult to look away, forests of a density and variety, that our own most accomplished naturalists would travel very far to study. Weather that was chaotic and dramatic and apparently entirely normal to the people who lived there, who walked around in the rain without any particular distress and looked at dramatic storm formations on the horizon with the mild appreciation of someone noticing an ordinary Tuesday. The courtyard had a small garden in its center, human-planted, obviously, with the particular organized abundance that characterizes the way they approach anything they consider worth tending. There were benches. There was a fountain. On the day I visited, a child was playing near the fountain, chasing some kind of small flying creature that kept evading her in the most unhelpful possible way, which was causing her great delight. She was perhaps 4 or 5 of her years old, dark curly hair, bright clothing, completely absorbed in her game, completely unaware of or uninterested in the various diplomatic personnel moving through the courtyard around her, laughing at the bird in the pure, unself-conscious way that only very small beings laugh, with the whole body involved. I watched her for quite a long time. I thought about the first contact files. I thought about the observer Voslin, who had written 600 years ago about the switch that turns on inside them. I thought about the Catharan paper that ended in the middle of a sentence. I thought about Sergeant Okafor and his quiet, considered answer. Every day, yes. I thought about 41 people in a dark corridor, holding themselves together for 17 hours because the job was not done. I thought about 12 pages about 3 species. I thought about a rule, written not to warn the galaxy, but to warn themselves. I watched the child chase the bird around the fountain, laughing, and I thought about everything she carried inside her without knowing it. Every 10,000 years of her species' history, every lesson learned the hard way and kept and passed forward, every capacity for ferocity and endurance and stubbornness, and the refusal to accept the arithmetic that lived in her biology and her culture and the stories her people told themselves about who they were. She tripped on the edge of the fountain and sat down hard on the courtyard stones. She looked surprised. Then she looked at her hands, which were scraped and slightly red from the fall. She got up. She looked around to see if anyone had noticed. She brushed off her hands. She looked back at the bird, which had landed on the edge of the fountain, and was watching her with what I can only describe as professional interest. She grinned. She went back to the game. I stood there in the garden of the interspecies embassy on the planet called Earth, and I felt something that I did not have a name for in Vorshen. I had to reach for a human word that I had learned from the diplomatic briefings, a word that describes an emotion they apparently value quite highly. The word is gratitude. But it does not fully cover what I felt. It was more specific than that. It was the particular relief of someone who has discovered that the most powerful thing in the room is also, under the right conditions, on your side. I went back to my station that evening and I began writing the document that would eventually become the official galactic record of the conflict, the most complete analysis of human military and diplomatic behavior ever produced by an external observer. I worked on it for 4 months. I revised it 11 times. My junior aide Asselin read every draft and told me with considerable candor which parts were insufficiently clear, which was most of them on the first pass. When it was done, I submitted it to the Vorshen Council with a request that it be distributed to every diplomatic academy in the galactic community. The request was approved within 2 days, which in Vorshen bureaucratic terms is essentially instantaneous, the equivalent of someone setting aside whatever they are doing and running. I titled the document, The Rule, an annotated history of why it exists. I spent a long time thinking about the first line. I wanted it to be accurate. I wanted it to be useful. I wanted whoever read it, young analyst, ancient elder, new civilization just beginning to look out at the stars and wonder what it would find there, to understand immediately what kind of document they were reading and what it would require of them. In the end, I wrote, I was wrong about everything, and I am fortunate to have survived being wrong. It remains the truest thing I have ever written. 3 new species petitioned to ally with the Terran government within a year of the conflict's end, not for military protection, not for resource agreements or territorial arrangement. Their petitions, which I read in full because it is my job to read things in full, said essentially the same thing in 3 different languages. One of them, the Marath, who had been living under Drathkai authority for 400 years before the human negotiators put 12 pages of text on a table and said this is not acceptable, put it most simply. Their ambassador said, "We want to be on the same side as people who fight like that for strangers." Director Hartley's response to all three petitions was the same: a handshake, a meal invitation, a welcome. Not a victory speech, not a list of conditions, not a strategic assessment of the alliance value. A meal. The way you welcome someone into your home. I think about that sometimes. I think about it when I look at the document I wrote and the word gratitude that I had to borrow because Vorshin does not have one quite like it. I think about the courtyard and the child and the bird, and the way she got up from the fall without crying and went straight back to the game. I think about Selora saying they are coherent. I think about what that means, fully, that the ferocity and the 12 pages and the meal invitation are not contradictions. They are the same thing. They are, in fact, the same sentence, said in different registers. We will fight for what matters. We will not stop until it is right, and when it is right, we will sit down and eat together. The rule is still there. It is still not officially written anywhere in the formal galactic record. It is still passed between elder diplomats in quiet corridors, still whispered at the ends of long council sessions, still carried in the institutional memory of every civilization old enough to remember why it matters. But I wrote it down, officially, for the first time, in the appendix of my document, in plain language that every species using the common galactic translator could read. I wrote, "Do not provoke the humans, not because they are cruel, not because they are bloodthirsty, not because they cannot be reasoned with or negotiated with or befriended. Do not provoke them because, when you harm the people they love, they will not stop. Not for exhaustion, not for mathematics, not for the arithmetic of winnable versus unwinnable. They will not stop. And when it is over, when every person they came for is home and safe, they will turn to you and offer conditions of peace that include protections for people you never even thought to protect. And you will have to sit with the understanding that the most dangerous thing you could have done was make them angry, and the second most dangerous thing was making them sad." I paused there for a long moment before writing the last sentence. Then I wrote, "The difference between those two things is the difference between losing and being forgiven, and you should know, before you make any decisions, that they are capable of both." That is where the document ends. Sergeant Nathan Okafor, the last time I saw him before his team rotated back to the Terran frontier, shook my hand in the human style, and told me that his grandmother would have liked me. I did not fully understand the compliment at the time, but I have thought about it often since, and I think it was one of the finest things anyone has ever said to me. The galaxy is quieter now. Not permanently, not forever. The galaxy is never quiet forever. But for now, in this moment, in this particular arrangement of stars and civilizations, and carefully maintained diplomatic channels, it is quieter. And somewhere in a courtyard in the embassy district of a water-blue planet circling an ordinary star, a child with dark curly hair is probably still chasing something that keeps evading her, laughing, falling down, getting up, going back. I find that, all things considered, immensely